Okay, so here's the deal. If you cut to 1802 in this video, you can see the final cutscenes for the final transmission. Now, before we begin, there's going to be spoilers for this video, so keep that in mind. The Callisto Protocol has finally got its final DLC in the form of the final transmission. It's roughly an hour and a half. It actually has, in my opinion, some pretty good additions in regards to the magnetic hammer and the biobot, and it really ratchets up the intensity, I want to say, a lot in comparison to the base game. It feels like essentially what the Callisto Protocol should have been all along, which is interesting that they saved it for the final chapter. With the magnetic hammer, it pretty much changes how combat is approached. If you've played the Callisto Protocol, you'll know by now that most combat is one-on-one. A lot of melee stuff. Sometimes you'll be able to switch to your weapons for a quick attack. But in the Callisto Protocol, the magnetic hammer has an AoE function. So if you charge down your attack, Jacob will immediately strike the ground. It creates this massive explosion, and it does damage to all the enemies in the surrounding area. This allows enemies to absolutely surround you, and it makes combat far more intense, which I greatly appreciate. The addition of the biobots is pretty nice too, because it finally gives you at least one more new enemy character, which I find interesting because it feels like they just could have fit the entire time with the base game. So which leads me to the question, where was this the entire time for the Callisto Protocol? And I'm serious when I say that, because this final chapter feels like a best hits compilation. Essentially, you're taking what worked for the Callisto Protocol, and that was those really intense moments, and having it happen the entire time while you're playing the final transmission. I mean, they even throw in a lot of cool psychological horror moments in which Jacob's having hallucinations, which I found to be really awesome, because I felt like that was something that was missing and absent in the Callisto Protocol's base game. And it really reminded me of Dead Space, in which Isaac would have his hallucinations with the marker. So I thought that was a really cool inclusion. And with these additions, it really helps ratchet up the intensity, because you have these biobots that you have to avoid. They seem to be a lot more aware of their surroundings. They're a lot more dangerous looking, at least, a lot more threatening. The kinetic hammer, like I said, really changes up the gameplay. So you're being swarmed by these biophage enemies who just happen to be incredibly dangerous. And when you're being swarmed and you're forced to actually fight groups of these, it feels like a different game. It feels like the Callisto Protocol finally understood that this is what it was meant to be the entire time, which is probably going to be surprising to everyone, because they finally got it. Striking Distance Studios finally understood that to make a great survival horror game, you have to have that sustained intensity. And in the final transmission, I really think that's where they succeed, because they try to throw all these different things at you. They literally took what was successful in the Callisto Protocol and applied it here. So in that regard, I think the final transmission was a success in terms of gameplay, what it was trying to convey, what it was trying to do. I appreciate that. But now, let's talk about the story. The final transmission picks up immediately after the Callisto Protocol ends. And if you remember, Jacob finds himself pretty much being attacked, or believing to be attacked, by the warden. And he sits there, and it like cuts to black, and we're all like, what just happened? And it really sets up a cliffhanger, which we all assumed would have been something that they would reveal or discuss in the DLC. And they kind of do it here. And I'm not going to lie to anyone, I felt like Striking Distance Studios pretty much gave up on the Callisto Protocol. The ending is probably going to frustrate a lot of people. I think it's honestly kind of cheap. I think it's kind of a scorched earth ending. Fairly definitive, especially in regards to Jacob's story. Like I said, if you skip to 1802 on the video, and I'll have a timestamp, you can see what I'm talking about. And I'm fairly certain by the reactions that I've seen online that a lot of people are just not satisfied. So why did Striking Distance Studios decide to end Jacob's story in this way? For me personally, I just think that the Callisto Protocol didn't meet sales expectations. Listen, when you have a game that comes out that's highly anticipated, like the Callisto Protocol, this is supposed to be the establishment of a new survival horror franchise, and the critics' scores just aren't kind to you. And honestly, I don't think many people were really high on this game to begin with, mainly because it feels like, you only get 46 hours in terms of the base game. There were a number of things that needed to be changed or updated. It really struggled to establish that sense of dread and anxiety that most survival horror games, especially the successful ones, have. I feel like this is probably the best way for Striking Distance Studios to kind of dust off its hands and move on. And it feels cheap. I think that's the best way to describe it, because what's in the Final Transmission DLC in terms of gameplay is actually, I think, a nice upgrade from the Callisto Protocol. It's not much, but having that magnetic hammer does change things a lot. But in terms of what it does narratively, it really feels like, now I've seen some articles that have talked about IP abandonment. I don't know necessarily if that's true, but I feel like when you introduce a protagonist and you stick with them for the entirety of a game, especially in regards to like survival horror, I think you want to immediately try to do at least one more go round. And you're not getting that here. Like, it took Striking Distance Studios from November all the way to June 2023 to come up with the Final Transmission. Now, I'm assuming they might have had something like this in mind the entire time, but I don't know if they realized just how dissatisfying this ending is. I'm being serious when I say this. I really feel like this is a massive misstep, because if you think people aren't going to remember what you did to your first IP as a studio, like, you're dead wrong. The internet obviously keeps receipts, and I feel like this is going to divide people pretty heavily. Because when I got to the ending of the Final Transmission, I honestly, up to that point, had a really good time. I really liked the fact that you were navigating different environments. Everything was just kind of falling apart around Jacob. His psyche was coming into question. I thought, this is really cool. I'm really hoping they don't pull some shit like everything you're doing right now was just some hallucination, because I always feel like those in any medium are just a really big cop out. And to my surprise, that's exactly what they did. When you see Jacob in that vegetative state, and you see Dr. Mahler pretty much trying to use him to push out that final transmission, I don't know what emotions the developers were trying to evoke, because I don't think during the base game anyone really had the time to become attached to Jacob as a character. Even with all the major revelations about what happened on Europa with Jacob and how he felt about the things unraveling in front of him, you really never got to hear from Jacob like how he felt about it. But in the final transmission, you kind of get these hints because he's having these hallucinations, and you're thinking to yourself, like, okay, so we're going to get something here. We're finally going to get that depth to this character. And it's really all surface level stuff, because when you find out that he's in a comatose state, I mean, he's pretty much on death's door. It's a wrap for Jacob, honestly. I think a lot of people are going to be frustrated. I think a lot of people are sitting there like, you just kind of wasted the potential of this character. And I couldn't help but think that as well, because while you could kind of see it coming, you were just kind of hoping that maybe, just maybe, Dr. Mahler saved Jacob. And yeah, he's having these hallucinations, but let's say he wakes up, let's say he's missing a limb or two, but Dr. Mahler can repair him, and that Jacob can go continue on with his mission. But it really never gets to that point. It's pretty much like the entire thing was a hallucination. You find out that Jacob's just really acting as a conduit of sorts for Dr. Mahler. And I really felt let down by that. Really felt like it was really cheap, because they introduced all these new things in the final transmission, and now you're pretty much telling yourself none of this was real. So what was the point? Because I think that one of the biggest failings of the Callisto Protocol base game was that you were introducing certain characters, and especially key ones like Dr. Mahler, and you really didn't have time to get to know them, their backgrounds or motivations, because we were constantly being pushed forward in this really cinematic horror experience. And in the final transmission, Dr. Mahler is front and center. So they give you these snippets in the form of audio dialogue about the things that she felt as she was conducting these experiences, her regrets, that type of stuff. And she's constantly in Jacob's ear telling him that, hey, he has to fight and keep fighting and stuff like that. And even though I think that the player is probably going to guess what was going to happen to Jacob, I don't think a lot of us wanted to accept it, especially if you played through the final transmission. You were thinking to yourself, like, maybe there's going to be a positive outcome. I just feel like we had all of these opportunities to establish this in the base game to really drive home the fact that this is the end of Jacob's story. But you get through the final transmission and you just kind of feel empty. Imagine if you're a fan of the Callisto Protocol, or even if you played the game before and you were like, I'll put it down till they make their adjustments or changes and patches, and let's see what the final DLC is going to be like. And then you realize that, hey, this is pretty good. This is what the Callisto Protocol could have been, and you're enjoying it. You're liking all the new additions. You like the fact that there are some areas that have multiple paths to them. You like the fact that exploration is kind of being rewarded. You like the new additions to the combat. You like the biobots because they're really cool looking. And you're kind of wondering what the entire mystery is surrounding Jacob's journey with Dr. Mahler. You're thinking about all these things. You're like, this is not bad. This is what the Callisto Protocol could have been. So you're pretty much excited to see, how it ends, because you are going to think to yourself that, look, maybe this is something that Striking Distance Studios can take, learn from, and put into their next project, which is potentially a sequel featuring Jacob. And then you get your hopes dashed because of this really scorched earth, what the fuck ending. What sucks to me, honestly, is that I really wanted to know more about Dr. Mahler in the Callisto Protocol. And here she plays this key role, but she's essentially just like this remorseful, regretful scientist who is trying to, correct things. And that's a trope that you see in a lot of sci-fi horror films. But the thing is, I really feel like she could have played a bigger role in the future. Like maybe she was going to help facilitate a cure or something. And then they're just like, nah, she's dead too. So you have Jacob dead, Mahler dead. And now you're left with this like feeling of just what the fuck did I just witness? And I don't know how else to explain it, because in my head, I was trying to justify the final transmission. I said, you know what? I really like the gameplay, but I don't think that the ending was right at any point in time, because I went back and said, I'm looking at my footage. I went, damn, they really killed this character off for no reason when he was just about to meet his potential. That's crazy to me. I just love looking on social media and seeing the reactions, because I think a lot of people were looking for the Callisto Protocol to kind of bounce back. And I made a video where I talked about how the changes that the developers had made to the gameplay really made the combat feel a bit more seamless. And I feel like the changes that were made to the gameplay in the final transmission really helped the Callisto Protocol as a whole, even though I don't think anything can be pushed over, right? Because the magnetic hammer is going to be specific to this DLC. But here's the deal. There were a number of directions that Striking Distance Studios could have went. And you have to ask yourself, why do they believe that this direction was the right one? And on top of that, why do you think having this comedic Easter egg at the end confirming Jacob's death is going to just satisfy fans? And it really feels like, and I don't, you know, I'm not trying to subscribe to this thought, but it really feels like a big fuck you to the fans, because for the most part, the final transmission up until the end is kind of a nice send off for the Callisto Protocol because of all the additions, because of the things that they actually do right. But then when you get toward the end, you're just like, okay, so you're pretty much telling me to go fuck myself, because not only did you include a very grim and dark ending that pretty much was devoid of all hope, that you also include this Easter egg ending in which Josh Duhamel is pretty much making light of the fact that Jacob is dead and dismembered. So I think that that to me is just one of those things where I just have to question what the developer's thought process was, because you could have included this cutscene literally after the fact, but I don't know if it's right to have it immediately follow up what would essentially be a pretty heavy cutscene and watching the main character just in this vegetative, completely ripped to shred state. I don't know what they were thinking, but I'm pretty sure it is not going to sit well with fans. So before we end the video, I just want to say that the Final Transmission overall is disappointing, primarily because of its ending. And it feels just, I don't know, man. It just feels just a little bit out of touch when you are willing to make light of what was essentially a really dark situation. I know that horror movies do it all the time, but you just had this crazy, in my opinion, solid experience finally in the Callisto Protocol. Like it finally picked itself up off the floor and kind of showed that it had hands. And for the most part, I was impressed with what they did here because there's a lot of diversity in terms of the gameplay, in terms of the environments, in terms of all this other stuff that like I feel like was missing. The intensity was there. That overwhelming feeling of anxiety was there as well. I just had this driving interest to figure out what was going on. And then you kind of threw this dud at the end. And it really, listen, once again, I don't want to say it was a fuck you to the fans. I just feel like narratively there was a number of places they could have went, and they went with what was essentially the most disappointing route. Now, here's the deal. With Striking Distance Studios, I don't think there's going to be anything toward IP abandonment. I would be fucking shocked if they did. If they just straight up abandoned the Callisto Protocol, I would be absolutely shocked to do so because one of the main characters is still alive. And so there is a lot of story to be told, and you could kind of do a lot there, in my opinion. I think you could absolutely continue this franchise, but that next game, if it does happen to come out, is going to have to make up for the Final Transmission. You are going to have to make it up to the fans because I think if you had goodwill, especially with all the changes they were trying to make, all the additions and DLC, I think that all of that goodwill is now probably gone, especially in considering how divisive the Final Transmission is going to be and currently is. So it would be, in my opinion, in their best interests to absolutely put their best foot forward when they put out an eventual sequel or whatever IP they put out next, because people are going to remember how they treated the Callisto Protocol. That's going to do it for this video. If you like the content, please consider like, sharing, and subscribing. Leave a comment below if you played the Callisto Protocol Final Transmission. Let me know how you felt about it. And you know what? If you just watched the final cutscenes, let me know how you felt about that as well. I'm Ken from Pixelated Thoughts, and I'll talk to you next time.
Why didn't you listen? Almost there.
Final report, Dr. Caitlin Marler. I found him in the Warden's Tower and dragged him here. His link to Danny's core still active. I used this connection to upload the full details of the experiment. Whether it will be received, I can't say. But it was our only hope to get the truth out there. To turn his sacrifice into opportunity.
Data transfer complete.
Finally. Jacob, you did it. And now, your fight is done.
Hey, where'd everybody go? Mahler! Louise! I'm not dead yet. I'm alive. I mean, Jacob's dead, but I'm still alive. This is Josh. Can somebody please let... Whoa! What the fuck happened to my legs? What the fuck happened to my legs? Somebody... Can somebody get me out of here? And bring me my goddamn legs!